Ivan stood by the window of his penthouse, the city sprawling beneath him like a kingdom he ruled but no longer cared for. The glass in his hand was half full, condensation trailing down his fingers, but he didn't notice. 6 years. 6 years he'd told himself this life was enough. He had power. He had money. He had the kind of influence men fought for. And yet, there was still that space inside him, untouched, hollow, untamed by everything he had achieved. He thought he'd sealed it off for good, but all it took was a walk through the park to undo it all. He'd been restless that day. No calls to return, no meetings to dominate, so he walked. His mind had been quiet for once, a rare thing, and he allowed the hum of life around him to fill the spaces usually crowded with strategy and ambition. Then he saw them. 2 girls, blonde hair catching what was left of the day's light as they spun near a fountain. He might have kept walking. Kids playing wasn't something he paid attention to. But there was something in the way they moved, the way they laughed. It was familiar, though he couldn't place why, until one of them turned, and he saw it. The locket, silver heart-shaped, glinting like a signal flare straight to his gut. His chest tightened. That locket was hers. Selena's. He'd given it to her years ago. Something simple, a small thing really, but she'd worn it every single day like it meant something. And then, one day, she was gone, no word, no trace, and now, here it was around the neck of a child with Selena's eyes. His eyes even moved before he even realized it. Step after step, closing the distance, but he wasn't fast enough. A voice, soft but firm, called out. Lily. Sophie, time to go. He followed, and there she was. Selena, sitting on a bench like she hadn't vanished off the face of the earth 6 years ago. Her hair was shorter, her face thinner, but it was her. His pulse pounded. He'd looked for her. After she disappeared, he'd torn his world apart trying to find her. And then he'd stopped. Forced himself to believe she'd left because she wanted to. But now there were 2 girls with hair like his and eyes just as blue. His daughters. There was no denying it. Selena looked, their eyes met. For a second, the whole world stilled. He saw it, the recognition in her gaze, the fear, the guilt, the weight of knowing this moment was inevitable. He took a step closer, his voice steady even though he felt like he was standing on the edge of a cliff. Selena. She froze, and then, almost like she had to force it, she spoke. Ivan. His name on her lips stirred things he'd thought long dead. Pain. Anger. But beneath it, something that still ached for her. The girls turned at their mother's tone, sensing something had shifted. And that was it. In one breath, Ivan's world fractured. 6 years thinking he was alone, and now 2 children stood just feet away. His children. Selena's fingers gripped the edge of the bench. He could see the way her body tensed like she might bolt. But she didn't. She stayed, barely. He closed more distance between them, each step measured, controlled. But inside, everything was Berlina, he said again, quieter this time, but she heard the steel beneath it. She didn't look away. Couldn't. Are they mine? He asked. He already knew. He needed her to say it. Her eyes shone as she nodded. Yes. It should have hit him like a blow, but it didn't. It settled deep in his chest like it had always been there, waiting for him to acknowledge it. His jaw clenched. Why? It was the only word he could get out. Why had she left? Why had she kept them from him? Why had she let him believe she was dead or worse? Not here. She whispered. Please. Her voice cracked on the word. His gaze flicked to the girls. They were watching them now, curious but unknowing. They don't know, Selena said. Not yet. Ivan's hands flexed at his sides. He wanted to scream. He wanted answers. But he wasn't going to do it here. Not in front of them. Selena reached into her bag, scrawled something on a slip of paper, and handed it to him. An hour, she said. Then she turned, called the girls to her, and walked away with them holding her hands. He watched them go, the locket glinting one last time in the dusk before it disappeared. He stood there long after they were gone, fingers clenched around the paper, so tightly it tore at the edges. He wasn't sure how long he stayed there. Eventually, though, he left. He had somewhere to be. The cafe she chose was small, quiet, not the kind of place he usually went to. But there she was, sitting in the corner, staring out the window like she could escape if she just looked hard enough. Ivan didn't hesitate. He slid into the seat across from her, his gaze sharp, unrelenting. Start talking, he said. Selena's fingers tightened around her coffee cup. I was scared. He didn't move. Of what? Me. She shook her head. Of what it would mean. Telling you. What it would do to you. To us. You don't get to make that choice for me. I know. Her voice was thin, honest. I know that now. He let the silence stretch. Let her sit in it. You were pregnant, he said flatly. After we broke up, yes. She drew in a breath. I found out after I left, and I thought about telling you. I wanted to, but you were so focused on your career, on the company, on everything else. I thought if I told you, you'd feel trapped, obligated. You didn't even give me the chance. His voice cut like glass. Selena blinked hard. I know, she said again, and I'll regret that every day. He sat back, exhaling slowly. So what now? He asked. I don't know, she admitted. But they deserve to know who you are. Something inside him softened at that. He'd spent years building a life where family wasn't even a concept. Now, he had 2 daughters, and no matter how they got here, he wasn't walking away. I want to meet them, he said. Selena nodded. Okay. The house was nothing like his penthouse. It was quiet, lived in, full of little things he'd never thought to notice before. Toys by the door, shoes lined up neatly, drawings taped to the fridge, and then there they were, Lily and Sophie, standing together in the doorway, staring at him like he was an exhibit they weren't sure was dangerous yet. Selena's voice was gentle. Girls, this is Ivan. Lily tilted her head. Why haven't we seen you before? Ivan's throat was tight. Because I didn't know you existed, he said. Not until a few days ago. Sophie blinked. That's silly, she said. How do you not know something like that? He smiled faintly. I'm starting to think you're right. Selena gave them space, but she didn't go far, letting them come to him at their own pace. He followed them inside. Everything was strange. Every second he was aware of what he'd missed, what he could still miss if he didn't get this right. They asked questions, innocent ones that broke his heart. Did he have a dog? No. Did he have a pool? Yes. Was his house bigger than theirs? And definitely. And finally, did he like ice cream? So of course, it was a slow process, but they let him in. Not completely. Not yet, but enough. Later, Selena handed him a photo. It was the girls, maybe 3 years younger, standing in a park. He ran his thumb over the image. You did a good job, he said quietly. Her eyes softened. I did my best. He met her gaze. So will I, Pa. And for the first time in years, he meant it. Every word. The next morning, Evan found himself standing in front of his bathroom mirror, staring at his reflection as if seeing someone entirely different. He ran his hand over his jaw, feeling the roughness of stubble he hadn't noticed the day before. His eyes were tired, but there was something new behind them. Purpose. For years he had been defined by his work, by control, but now there was something else. 2 someones, who changed everything without even knowing it. By noon, he was back at the house. Selena had invited him, and he wasn't going to waste the chance. As he pulled up to the curb, he caught sight of the girls playing in the yard. Lily was kneeling in the grass with a book open on her lap, while Sophie was twirling, her arms stretched wide, spinning in circles until she toppled over into the grass with a laugh. Selena stepped onto the porch, wiping her hands on a towel. You're early. Ivan shrugged. Better than late. She gave a faint smile, then called out to the girls. Sophie! Ivan's here! Sophie shot to her feet immediately, racing toward him, but stopped halfway as if remembering something. She glanced back at her mom. Selena nodded, encouraging, and then Sophie kept going, a little slower this time, like she wasn't sure what the rules were yet. Sophie said when she reached him, tipping her head back to meet his eyes. You're early. So I've been told. Ivan replied, crouching down so they were closer to eye level. I thought maybe we could spend a little more time together today. If that's okay. Sophie's eyes flicked toward Lily, who was still sitting with her book. We have ballet later, she said seriously. I know, Ivan replied. Your mom told me. I was hoping I could come and watch. Sophie studied him for a moment before nodding. Okay. Lily didn't look up from her book when Evan approached. He sat on the grass, not too close, not wanting to crowd her. What are you reading today? She turned the cover slightly so he could see. Another adventure story. I read that one, he said. When I was about your age. Lily gave him a sidelong glance, clearly skeptical. You read books? He smiled. Not as much as I should now. But back then I did. Especially stories like that one. She stared at him for a moment longer before asking. What happens at the end? He leaned in conspiratorially. I won't tell you. You'll have to finish it yourself. That seemed to satisfy her for now. Later, Ivan found himself sitting on the floor of the living room, trying to follow the complex rules of a board game Sophie insisted he play. She was serious about it, explaining every turn with military precision. Lily sat on the couch nearby, occasionally watching, sometimes going back to her book. Selena moved through the house quietly, like she didn't want to intrude but was always aware of what was happening. When Sophie declared herself the winner again, she beamed at Ivan. "You're not very good at this. I'm out of practice," Ivan replied, lifting his hands in defeat. Sophie giggled, then said suddenly, "Mom says you work in a tall building." "I do," he said. "Very tall. Do you have an office?" Lily asked from the couch. "I do," Ivan said. "Would you like to see it sometime?" They both looked at each other, and for the first time, Evan saw something spark between them. Curiosity, maybe. Possibility. Selena appeared in the doorway. "Girls, get your things. We have to leave in 10 minutes. Sophie jumped up immediately and dashed down the hall. Lily followed more slowly, but she wasn't dragging her feet. Ivan stood and walked over to Selena. They stood there for a moment, the air between them heavy with all the things they still hadn't said. "She's warming up," Selena said quietly. "I'm not in a rush," Evan replied, and for once it was true. He wasn't thinking about efficiency. He wasn't thinking about maximizing results. He was just there, present. At the ballet studio, Evan sat in the back row while Sophie danced. He expected to be bored. Business meetings often left him restless. But watching his daughter, this little girl who moved with such energy and joy, he realized he could have stayed there all day. Sophie glanced at him twice during practice, her face lighting up each time she found him still watching. After the lesson, Evan walked with them to the car. Sophie slipped her hand into his, like it was the most natural thing in the world. Selena noticed but didn't say anything. Neither did he. Back at the house, Selena invited him to stay for dinner again. He agreed without hesitation. The evening was easier this time. The girls talked more. Lily asked him questions about his office, his car, whether or not he'd ever seen a real pirate ship. He told her he hadn't, but if he ever did, he'd take a picture for her. After the girls went to bed, Selena stood in the kitchen rinsing dishes, and Evan dried them without being asked. The domesticity of it should have made him uncomfortable. It didn't. "You're doing better than I expected," Selena said finally. He glanced at her. "I'm learning as I go." She handed him a plate. Their fingers brushed. Neither of them pulled away immediately. "Thank you," she said softly. "For what?" "For showing up, Doc." He held her gaze. "I should have been here all along." Selena dried her hands and turned toward him, leaning against the counter. "I was angry at you for a long time. I blamed you for how things ended." "You should," Evan said. "I was difficult." She gave him a faint smile. "That's one word for it." He almost laughed. Instead, he stepped a little closer. "I can't change the past, Selena, but I can be here now." She searched his face for a long time. "I'm not asking for anything." "I know." They stood there, inches apart, and neither of them moved for what felt like a long time. It wasn't about romance. Not yet, maybe not ever. It was about something deeper, trust. They had broken it once. Now, they were slowly rebuilding. When Ivan left that night, he stood on the porch for a moment, watching the lights go out in the girls' room. He felt something settle inside him. Not peace, but something close to it. He walked back to his car knowing one thing for certain. He was staying, and he wasn't going to run from this. Not again. The days blurred into weeks, but Ivan never missed a visit. Each time he arrived at the house, he noticed something new. Small details he'd never thought to look for in his old life. Sophie's ballet shoes by the door, their worn soles showing signs of dedication. Lily's books stacked unevenly on the coffee table, a page marked by a ribbon, waiting for her to return. Drawings taped to the fridge, messy stick figures holding hands, labeled with their names. One day, there was a new one. It showed 4 figures instead of 3. He didn't ask about it. He didn't have to. It was late afternoon, and Selena was in the kitchen again, cooking something that smelled better than anything he'd eaten in his glass and steel penthouse. Sophie was sprawled on the floor, coloring furiously, tongue sticking out in concentration. Lily sat by the window, legs folded under her, scribbling in a notebook. Ivan leaned against the doorframe, watching them like they might disappear if he blinked. "You're quiet today," Selena said without turning around. "Just taking it in," he replied. She glanced at him then, her expression unreadable. "They're starting to expect you now." He nodded. "That's the idea." Selena's gaze softened, but she didn't say more. She didn't need to. After dinner, Lily handed him the notebook she'd been writing in. I made a list, she said seriously. Evan took it carefully, flipping through the pages. In Lily's neat handwriting, she'd listed things she wanted to do. Some simple, some impossible. Go to the zoo, see a real castle, find buried treasure. He smiled. I think we can manage a few of these. She nodded. But you have to promise. Evan met her gaze. I'll promise. She seemed to weigh his answer, then slowly offered him one of her small, rare smiles. It hit him harder than he expected. This wasn't about grand gestures. This was about showing up, about keeping his word, about making a list with his daughter and proving, one by one, that he was there. Later, after the girls had gone to bed, Selena walked him to the door. He lingered, not ready to leave just yet. You're making progress, she said quietly. It doesn't feel like enough. Evan admitted. She shook her head. They don't need perfect. They need you. He stood there for a long time after she closed the door, staring at the quiet house. He'd spent years believing success would fill the emptiness. But the truth was standing behind that door, asleep in rooms filled with drawings and stuffed animals. The following Saturday, he took them to the zoo. It was hot, crowded, and chaotic, everything he usually avoided. But Sophie's excitement was contagious, and even Lily smiled when they got to the tiger exhibit. She stood at the glass, eyes wide, while Evan lifted Sophie so she could see better. I think he's looking at me, Sophie whispered, eyes huge. Evan chuckled. Probably wondering if you're faster than he is. She giggled, and for a moment, he let himself just be. Not the CEO, not the man who had lost 6 years, just a father holding his daughter, watching her world open a little wider. Lily tugged on his sleeve. You promised ice cream, she reminded him. I did, he agreed. And I keep my promises. They found a vendor and sat on a bench. Sticky fingers and napkins everywhere. Sophie made a mess of hers, chocolate smeared across her cheek. Evan wiped it away with a laugh. Something so simple it surprised him how natural it felt. Afterward, they visited the gift shop. Sophie picked out a small stuffed tiger. Lily found a book about animals. Evan paid without hesitation, thinking it was the best money he'd spent in years. On the way home, Sophie fell asleep in the car, her head resting against her sister's shoulder. Lily stayed awake, staring out the window. She's heavy, Lily said after a while. Evan smiled. You can lean on me if you want. She glanced at him but said nothing. Then, slowly, she shifted closer. He didn't move, didn't make a sound. Just sat there while his daughter rested against him, trusting him to stay. When they got back, Selena carried Sophie inside while Evan walked with Lily. She was quiet, but she didn't let go of his hand. He wondered if she even realized she was holding it. Thank you, Selena said softly when they were alone on the porch. For what? For making them happy. He nodded, feeling something settle in his chest. It's what I should have been doing all along. Inside, he could hear Lily's voice, faint but clear, telling her sister about the tiger, about the ice cream, about how Evan had promised they'd go see a castle next. He smiled, knowing that promise was already made in his heart. One evening, Selena invited him to stay after the girls went to bed. They sat on the back porch, the summer air warm around them. You've changed, she said after a while. I had to, Evan replied. She looked at him, her expression thoughtful. I wasn't sure you would. He met her gaze. I wasn't sure either. They sat there, the silence easy this time. He found himself watching her hands, remembering the way they used to fit in his, the way they brushed hair from her face when she was nervous. Some things hadn't changed. You were gone, he said suddenly, the words pulled from him like a confession. I thought you were dead, or worse. Selena's eyes darkened. I didn't mean for it to be like that. You could have told me. She nodded. I know, I was scared. You keep saying that. Because it's true. He looked away, staring out at the yard where the girls had left their toys scattered. I'm not going anywhere, he said quietly. She was silent for a long time. Then she stood and walked back inside without another word. But the door didn't close. It stayed open. Over the next few weeks, Evan became a fixture in their lives. School drop-offs, ballet recitals, weekend trips to the park. He didn't miss a single one. His assistant adjusted his schedule. His board questioned his priorities. He didn't care. He knew what mattered now. One morning, Lily handed him a picture she'd drawn. It was the four of them, Selena, Sophie, Lily, and him, standing in front of a castle. The sun was bright in the corner, and everyone was smiling. I think we're ready for the next thing on my list, she said seriously. What's that? Evan asked. She pointed. The castle. He grinned. Let's go find one. Selena stood behind her, watching her expression soft. There was something there he couldn't quite name yet, but it was real. They spent that weekend exploring an old estate outside the city. The girls called it a castle, and Evan didn't correct them. They ran through the halls, their laughter echoing off the stone walls, and Evan realized he would have done anything to hear that sound. Later, they sat on a blanket in the grass, eating sandwiches Selena had packed. Sophie was covered in crumbs. Lily had grass stains on her knees. Selena leaned back on her elbows, eyes closed, smiling in the sun. Evan sat beside her, watching the girls chase each other. He felt her hand brush against his. He didn't move away, neither did she. For the first time in a long time, Evan Sterling felt like he was exactly where he belonged. It was a Saturday evening when Evan realized how much his life had changed. Not in a sudden, dramatic way, but slowly, piece by piece. Like a puzzle that had once been scattered, and now was forming a picture he hadn't expected. He was no longer chasing deals or filling his calendar with endless meetings. Instead, his focus had shifted, toward Lily, toward Sophie, toward Selena. The girls had invited him to their movie night. They insisted he bring popcorn. Real popcorn, not the microwave kind, Lily had clarified. So Evan found himself standing in Selena's kitchen, pouring kernels into a pot, listening to them giggle from the living room. He never would have imagined himself here. He had always paid people to do things like this. Now he wanted to do them himself. Selena walked in, drying her hands on a towel. You're getting the hang of this. Evan glanced at her. I follow instructions well. She smiled at that, leaning against the counter. You always did. He focused on the popcorn, shaking the pot gently as it began to pop. I was a different man back then. Selena studied him. Maybe, but I think this version was always there, buried under a lot of ambition. He glanced over his shoulder. And a lot of arrogance. She laughed softly, the sound warm and easy. It was strange to be comfortable around her again. After everything, he thought they'd be stuck in awkward silences. But here they were, talking like old friends. Maybe more than friends, though he wasn't ready to name it. The popcorn finished, and Evan dumped it into a bowl, carrying it into the living room where the girls were already wrapped in blankets. Sophie patted the spot next to her, and Evan sat without hesitation. The movie started, but Evan barely watched. Lily leaned against Selena, and Sophie pressed close to him, her tiny hand resting on his arm. He found himself listening to their breathing, the small sighs they made when something funny happened, the way they whispered to each other about what might come next in the story. Halfway through, Lily climbed over Selena's lap and settled herself on Evan's other side. She didn't say anything, just rested her head against him. He glanced at Selena, who smiled softly but said nothing. It was these moments that made everything real. No courtroom battle could have given him this. No contract, no negotiation. Only time, only trust. When the movie ended, Selena carried a half-asleep Sophie to bed while Evan walked Lily to her room. She climbed into bed without protest, pulling the covers up to her chin. Will you be here tomorrow? She asked quietly. I will, Evan said. I'm not going anywhere. She nodded but didn't look convinced. Not yet. He smoothed the blanket over her shoulders. Good night. Good night, she whispered. He turned off the light and closed the door halfway, leaving it open just enough. Selena was waiting for him in the hallway. You're good with them, she said softly. I wasn't sure I would be. I think they were. They stood there for a moment, neither moving. Then Selena stepped past him, heading back downstairs. He followed, feeling something unspoken settle between them. On Sunday, they spent the morning at a park, the girls racing ahead, chasing each other through the trees. Evan pushed them on the swings, catching Lily when she jumped off mid-air. She landed hard, but she laughed anyway. Selena watched from the bench, smiling in that quiet way of hers. Later, they picnicked on the grass. Sophie stole grapes from Evan's container when she thought he wasn't looking. Lily told a story about a dragon that had stolen a crown, her hands waving dramatically as she spoke. Evan listened, completely absorbed, as if there was nothing else in the world that mattered. And there wasn't. As they packed up, Selena brushed grass from her jeans. They're different with you here. Better or worse? Evan asked. She tilted her head. Happier. He nodded, understanding that happiness wasn't something he could buy or force. It was something he had to earn. Every single day. That evening, after he dropped them off, he found himself standing outside his penthouse windows, looking out at the city. It didn't mean what it used to. The skyline was beautiful, but it wasn't home. He thought about the little house with the squeaky porch swing, the girl's drawings on the fridge, Selena humming under her breath while she cooked. He poured himself a drink, but it stayed untouched on the table beside him. He wasn't sure who he was anymore, but he was certain of who he wanted to be. 2 weeks later, Lily asked him to come to her school's book fair. She handed him a flyer, serious as a contract negotiation. "There's a list of books I need," she said, tapping it like a CEO presenting a merger. Evan grinned. "Need?" she confirmed. He cleared his schedule without a second thought. At the fair, Lily led him through the tables with surgical precision, pointing out titles and explaining which ones were acceptable. Sophie tagged along, occasionally distracted by stuffed animals and sparkly pens. Evan bought them everything they asked for, knowing this wasn't about the things. It was about showing up. At checkout, the woman behind the register smiled. "Your daughters love to read." Evan hesitated. Selena glanced at him, then answered, "They do." He looked at Lily, who didn't correct the woman. She just took her books and started stacking them neatly in her bag. Sophie tugged his sleeve. "Can we get ice cream?" "Of course," he said. They sat at a small table afterward, ice cream melting in the late afternoon heat. Sophie dripped strawberry onto her lap and didn't care. Lily ate hers slowly, watching Evan in a way he was getting used to. "You're not wearing a suit," she observed. He glanced down at his jeans and t-shirt. "I figured it wasn't a suit kind of day." She nodded, satisfied. "You look better." Selena stifled a laugh, and Evan smiled, surprised at how much he cared about a 6-year-old's approval. Later that night, Selena called him after the girls were asleep. He answered on the first ring. "You're good with them," she said again. "I'm trying." She was quiet for a moment. "You're succeeding." He exhaled slowly. "That means a lot coming from you." "It's the truth." There was another pause, longer this time. "I'm glad you came back," she said finally. "I didn't know I was coming back," he admitted. "But I'm glad I did." He didn't sleep much that night, but for the first time in years, it wasn't because of stress or work. It was something else. Hope. The following weekend, he took the girls to a museum. Lily was fascinated by the ancient history exhibits, while Sophie wanted to see the dinosaurs. They spent hours wandering through the halls, Lily reading every plaque out loud, Sophie dragging Ivan from one skeleton to another. At lunch in the museum cafe, Lily slid a drawing across the table to him. It was simple, a stick figure family standing in front of the dinosaur exhibit. 4 figures, one of them labeled Dad. Evan traced his thumb over the paper. "This is us." Lily nodded. "Yeah." He didn't say anything right away, just smiled. "Thank you." Sophie leaned across the table. "Next time we should go to the aquarium." Evan nodded. Next time. And he meant it. He always would. The sun was low in the sky as Evan stood in Selena's backyard, watching Lily and Sophie chase each other through the grass. Their laughter carried on the warm breeze, filling the air with a sound he'd once thought he'd never hear. He glanced towards Selena, who sat on the porch steps, barefoot, sipping tea as she watched them too. Her gaze drifted to Ivan, and for a moment, neither of them said a word. They didn't have to. He walked over and sat beside her, his shoulders brushing against hers. She didn't move away. Instead, she tilted her head toward him just slightly, enough to let him know she was there, and maybe, that she wanted him there too. "You're a part of them now," she said quietly. "I want to be," Ivan replied. His voice was steady, certain. Selena smiled faintly. "You are." For a long time, Ivan had believed his life was about the things he could control. The business deals, the numbers, the endless pursuit of more. But sitting here, with his daughters running free and Selena by his side, he understood something else. This was the life he'd never let himself believe he could have. Not perfect, but real. Lily called out to him, "Dad, come push us on the swing." The word still caught him off guard, but it settled into him in a way that felt natural now. He stood, brushed his hands on his jeans, and glanced back at Selena. She nodded, her eyes soft. He crossed the yard and took hold of the swing's ropes, giving Lily a gentle push while Sophie waited her turn. They talked about school and books and ice cream, about castles and dragons, and even listened to every word like it was the most important thing in the world. Because it was. As twilight settled in, and the girls yawned their way inside for bedtime, Ivan stayed on the porch with Selena. They didn't talk about the past. They didn't need to. They sat there together, watching the stars appear one by one. And for the first time, Ivan wasn't thinking about what he'd lost. He was thinking about what he'd found. He was home.